I so much wanted to, just have a chance to get together, um, really just to commiserate. There's so many more tragic things. Unfortunately, there's so many more tragic things going on day by day that
Yeah.
our summer vacation being upended really seems the least of it. But nevertheless, it really is quite disappointing. I know because I've been speaking to many of you on a regular basis for many months, um, how much we were all looking forward to this and how disappointing it is. And, everybody really took it, I think with, the best possible attitude because we all understand there's nothing to be done. And I must tell you that when we made the decision, we kind of woke up from Shabbat last week realizing that the whole trip was imperiled, and we really were forced to make a decision sooner rather than later because many of you were already going to be getting on planes to start traveling to Europe, or some of you who were meant to be traveling with us from Jerusalem were first going to be traveling from America or returning from America to home in Jerusalem to get on planes with us. And some of you were still stuck there or would have no ways to get here. So we realized we had to decide sooner rather than later. But then there's always the danger that we pull the plug prematurely and then the Ayatollah comes to his senses and there's peace on earth and goodwill towards men. And we've canceled the trip, which couldn't at that point really be rescheduled. But I guess I have to say, unfortunately, even that does not seem to be does not seem to be the case. There really is no way that any of us would be able to get on that plane a week from a week from tonight. At least that's what it seems like right now. So I'm comforted in the knowledge that we made the right decision, but I'm saddened by the fact that the decision had to be made. Hopefully, not hopefully, definitely, Agnon House will reschedule this tour. Exactly when is not clear. It looks likely it'll have to be next spring. As soon as those dates are set, we will let you know. And of course, you are all have first crack at signing up or even just letting us know, and we'll re-register you based upon all the information we have on file. Um, and we hope, of course, that as many of you as possible will be able to travel with us. We hope that we'll all be in good health and there'll be peaceful times all over the world, particularly here in Israel, that will allow us to go. I know that some of you have been affected by the events going back to October 7th, but particularly of the last week or so, more directly, Ruth Katz is with us. She's in Tel Aviv. Her apartment was damaged. She had shrapnel come through her windows. She sent me pictures yesterday, the day before, of this. Thank God she's okay, and her apartment will be repaired. But what a terrible thing. And our good friend Eliakim, who most of you don't know, except for the very few of you who've traveled with us in the past, who know, Shlomo's nodding because he knows how important it is to have Eliakim Itali with us. Um, Eliakim is, just the most amazing technical, logistical person. He would really be in charge of keeping us all fed and keeping us all safe. And he was with us last month. I did the Agnon trip to Provence. Actually, Shlomo and Alan were with us, and they were meant to be coming with us again. Um, and then in between, while I'm still trying to catch up on my sleep from that trip, Eliakim's already been to the Galapagos Islands and is now trying to get back. So he very much wanted to be with us, and he asked that I say hello, and he's looking forward to meeting you. I know, just on a technical note, I mean, I wrote to you all. Obviously, you're all concerned about the issue of refunds. We still need a couple more days to get that straightened out, so the agent can really get, I hope, almost all of your money refunded. But it'll take a couple of days before that can be taken care of, and I'll be in touch. You'll have to send us your information about how the refunds should be made. We also have this WhatsApp group that we set up. Do me a favor, stay on the WhatsApp group. We won't use it. We won't flood you with nonsense. We'll really use it just to inform you of future goings on that are connected to our trip or to Agnon or to future travel things. It won't be one of these things where you're inundated with nonsense 24/6 or 24/7. I'm particularly sad about the trip not taking place because I've done this trip before. In 2022, we did a very almost identical itinerary
Yeah.
to Prague, Vienna, and Budapest. It was really a wonderful trip. And I know that the highlight was traveling with my friend and companion and teacher, David Bernstein, who, together with me, leads the tour. And, just the amount that I learned from him every time we travel together and the amount that you will learn with him when we take this trip again. So, David, say hello and
Sure. So first of all, um, I'm just subscribing to the disappointment. I happen to have been in Prague and just came back 24 hours before the first siren here in Israel, fortunately. And so I can tell you that it's just such a beautiful city with such a rich Jewish history. And I'm sorry we couldn't do it now. I'm sorry for not only for you, I'm sorry for me that I couldn't do it now. And Vienna and Budapest are also so rich with Jewish history and such beautiful Habsburg Empire capital cities that we will hopefully be doing this again sometime in the spring, we hope. And I look forward to be able to meet all of you personally then and to be spending that week or 10 days together and getting to know each other as well.
thank you.
Are you sure that the golem will still be there when we come next?
If the golem is there, he'll still be there. The truth is I think one of the highlights of our trips, and I think one of the reasons that people come back again and again, trip after trip. We have people, though the overwhelming majority of you are first time travelers with us. We have people that have been with us on I
Yeah,
think people that were meant to be on this trip. It was meant
that's
going to
right.
be their fifth year in a row traveling with us. And to me, that's a great source of pride. And I think that part of what attracts people, and I assume what attracted many of you to to um, to the tour, was that we really do pride ourselves on having a very serious learning component to what we do. In addition to the wonders of travel and the beauties of nature and experiencing things, we do spend a lot of time, learning together, thinking together, learning from one another, and that involves, some of the people on the tour doing some teaching and speaking, either lectures in the evening or things on the bus. Of course, David is the primary teacher and guide, both in the field and at other times. And I do a fair amount of teaching. So we thought as a small consolation prize that I would give one of the talks that I would have given. This would have been on the first night, meaning the first full night, the first night after the first full day in Prague after dinner. You would have all been very tired. Some of you would have dozed off. So in some ways, it's better because you'll get more out of this little talk. But if we should go on this tour again, I may repeat this lecture. So I'm counting on the fact that you won't all remember it. It'll be okay. So let me just share here. Uh,
Can I
this is
just say,
these. Hmm?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to share one quick thing in reference to what he said about the Golem being in Prague. When I told my grandchildren that I wasn't going, my 7-year-old grandson said, "But Bubby, does that mean we're not going to get the Golem? Because I
Uh,
promised to bring the Golem back."
yeah. Well, if you go to Prague, there's no end of kitschy knickknacks and
Yeah, I
tchotchkes
remember you had told us
and
that.
uh, and souvenirs with Golem on it. So
We
uh,
have one.
anyway, these are some scenes of places we've been to in the past. But I wanted to talk about what really would have been one of the highlights of our first day in Prague, and that's the old Jewish cemetery in Prague, which goes back to the beginning, I think, of the 16th century, and it contains literally thousands and thousands and thousands of graves, including of some very important, distinguished Jewish figures, both rabbis and communal leaders and scholars and men and women. Perhaps the highlight of the trip in Prague is the grave of the Maharal, the famed Rabbi Maharal of most people know about the Maharal through the legend of the Golem. And when we're together next time in Prague, we'll talk about that legend. But we're not going to do that tonight. Instead, we're going to talk about Rivka Tiktiner. Rivka Bas Rav Meir Tiktiner, whose grave we would have been standing by a week from tomorrow. Rivka Tiktiner died in Prague on the 25th of Nisan in the year 1605. It means she was in almost an exact contemporary of the Maharal, right? The Maharal died in Prague in 1609, right? So she was alive and active in Prague during the lifetime of Maharal. And this is her grave. Now, last year, for those of you that were with us in Poland, I spoke about her because we were in Tiktin. There's a city, Tiktin. If you remember, it's those of you that have been to Poland on other tours. Tiktin is that city with that amazing wooden shul with the painted shul. And I mentioned to her, now she's called Tiktiner because her family was from Tiktin, even though she lives in Prague. You don't get a name like Tiktiner if you live in Tiktin, right? Because then everybody would have that name. You don't get a name like think of people like you must know people whose last name are Berlin or Berliner or Varshaviak, right? Krakower, right? These are all Jewish names that one gets when they leave the city, right? You move from Krakow to Berlin, right? And then you get that last name because you become known as the one who comes from Krakow, or the one who comes from Tiktin. So who is Rivka Bat Rav Meir Tiktiner, and why do we make mention of her? There aren't too many 16th century female figures that are so distinguished that we have too much knowledge about them. That was sadly the case of Jewish women in the Middle Ages. But Rivka Bat Rav Meir Tiktiner, or Rivka Tiktiner, was really a very distinguished woman. She was, to the best of our knowledge, the first Jewish woman to write and publish a book. She publishes a book called the Menekes Rivka. Here in an English translation, there's an English translation of it that was published by the Jewish Publication Society. There's a Hebrew edition, an old Hebrew edition, and there's a brand new Hebrew edition that was just published in the last few weeks. But the book itself is, of course, written in Yiddish, right? A woman writing for other Jewish women in the 16th century could have only been writing in Yiddish, right? To write in any other language, at least, of course, in Central Europe.
Nagel עוד פעם. Nagel.
Hi, folks, if you could maybe mute. You can mute yourselves. I'm going to mute you all. Okay. I've muted you all. But if you want to say something, feel free to unmute. So it's a book in Yiddish, which is a collection of drashot, of sermons, and she was known quite remarkably as a woman who delivered sermons and Torah lessons. It's teachings on Pirkei Avot. It's all types of kind of common advice, good advice, both halachic advice and matters of minhag and Jewish custom about the holidays. It's advice about how to maintain shalom bayit, harmony in the home, how to get along with your mother-in-law. That's a very important thing that you need to write to your audience if you're producing a kind of handbook of life for Jewish women, and how to raise your children with yirat shamayim and piety and all these types of things. It's kind of book that deals with all of the facets of women's life, including some matters related to health. She very strongly cautions her readers against bava mices, against superstitions, against good luck charms, and kameot,
Amulets.
Amulets to ward off the evil eye or to ward off the whooping cough or things like that. She really is very, very far ahead of her time in really advocating for what then would have been the best known medicines, and And she also has a certain amount of halachic material and guidance on matters related to taharat hamishpacha, to Jewish marital law related to mikvah, menstruation, etc. And this Meinekes Rivka, what we're seeing here on the left side of the page, is the original edition 1609, published in Prague in 1609, which means that it was published posthumously. She dies in 1605. The first printed edition is published in 1609, which means it had been circulating in manuscript beforehand. This edition of the 1609 Prague copy is a yatom. It's an orphan. It's the only extant copy, and it's at the Friedrich Alexander University in Bavaria. Now, what we're going to do is take a really wild ride throughout Jewish history. And we're going to see how this book touches on so many different things. And this is to give you a taste of the kind of learning that we would have been doing together during the week. How everything connects together and how it touches on some big themes that would have only really become clear as we were wrapping up in Budapest 10 days later. And we'll do it here as a kind of tasting menu. It's not the full experience, but of course, from this book in the beginning of the 17th century, we get immediately to Shai Agnon. Now, this is a reflection of my own interests. It's a reflection of the fact that our tour is organized by the Agnon House in Yerushalayim. And we hope when times return to normal and you visit Jerusalem, you'll come and visit us at the Beit Agnon. But what we see here on the screen is the Agnon House, not the one in Jerusalem, but Agnon's home in Germany. Agnon is born in Galicia, in what today is Western Ukraine. And he goes off on Aliyah in 1908 at around the age of 20. But in 1912, he leaves the land of Israel to go to Germany. And he ends up having a prolonged stay. He never intended on staying forever, but he ends up staying in Germany for 12 years. Part of this was because World War I broke out and it was impossible to travel. He gets married. They have 2 children. These things tend to delay one's aliyah. I know very many friends who live in America who are planning on coming on aliyah next year. This has been going on for 30 years that they're planning on coming on aliyah next year. Next year is always, a year away. Agnon is living in Bad Homburg. Bad Homburg is not Hamburg, right? Hamburg is a different city. Bad Homburg is a spa town right outside of Frankfurt am Main. And he's living there with his family, with his wife and 2 children in the upper story of this multi-family home when a fire breaks out on the night of June 4th, 1924, almost exactly 101 years ago. The family is spared, but almost all of their possessions go up in flames. His library of many thousands of books that he had collected goes up in flames. Very little is saved. The manuscripts of 2 nearly completed works go up in flames. He forgot to, save it on the cloud or put it on a disk on key, right? Could you imagine you work on writing a book, right? And here 2 books. One was going to be his first novel, and the other was going to be a project he was working on with Martin Buber, collecting an anthology of Hasidic tales. Buber later published his share of that project. It's known as, in English, it's called The Tales of the Hasidim. In English, it's called, in Hebrew, it's called Or HaGanuz, this collection, this anthology of Hasidic tales. And they go up in flames, and what's to be done? Years later, 1966, Agnon receives the Nobel Prize, and he in his speech before the King of Sweden, he talks about this experience. It was something that haunted him throughout his life. And if you come to Beit Agnon today, you'll see his massive library of many thousands of volumes, which he rebuilt. But that loss of books and the haunting feeling of what does it mean for something written to disappear? What does it mean for something that, for a book, for knowledge to go up in flames? is an idea that haunts him, and it appears as a theme throughout his writings. In Stockholm in 1966, he describes how 4,000 Hebrew volumes, most of which had come down to me from my forebears, and some of which I had bought with money set aside for my daily bread, went up in flames. Among the books that go up in flames, he writes to his publisher. He writes to Mr. Shokin, his publisher. All day I see the parchment burning, but this is the days after the fire. He's talking about being haunted by the what had happened to me. He says, all day I see the parchment burning, but its letters are soaring to heaven. And even at night, my heart will not rest. He's, of course, here playing off of the Gemara and Masechet Avodah Zarah that we know from the piyutim recited on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur about the 10 martyrs, the rabbis who were martyred by the Romans. Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion, who's burned at the stake with his Torah scroll is wrapped around him, and as he's there on the flames and the parchments are burning, Amrulo Talmidav, his students say to him, Rabbi, ma ata ro'eh, what do you see? Amar lahem gvilin nisrafin ve'otiyot porchot ba'avir. I see that the parchment is burning, but the letters of the Torah are flying up to heaven, are soaring up to heaven. So Agnon is playing off of that rabbinic midrash about the death of Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion, right? The mystical element that the letters, the words, right? The Torah itself can be burnt. The physical book can be burnt, but the spiritual book cannot be burnt. And it alights and ascends to heaven. So it's as if he's saying that novel that I wrote, which will now never be published in this world, but it's like in the library in heaven, right? It's in the archive. It's in the archive in heaven. Years later, Agnon wrote a kind of strange. It's not a story. It's not a work of fiction. It's a kind of memoiristic piece. It's called Yeshanot V'Gam Chadashot. It's published. He has a collection of nonfiction writing, which contain letters and speeches and other types of miscellany. And he has got this. It's got this like autobiographical, memoiristic essay about his childhood, about growing up in this little town called Buchach in Galicia, and particularly about the intellectual culture of the place and the book culture of the place. He was a lifelong bibliophile from the time he's a young child. And in passing in this work, he says the following. He was describing all the types of books that people had. He's at one point he's talking about Mama Lashon, about what Yiddish meant, because Yiddish, of course, was his first language. Even though he goes on to become the great Hebrew author, Yiddish was his first language. It was the language spoken at home, was the language spoken on the street. And he describes the kinds of books that the women in town had. He says there were books in our humble grandmother's possessions, such as the laws of salting meat, the laws of women, and tchinas. Tchinas are like womanly prayers that are not so commonly recited today. But women who sometimes women were not literate in Hebrew and they couldn't necessarily even read the Hebrew prayers from the Siddur, but they had Yiddish prayers called tchinas. Tchinas are kind of like petitions, things you pray for, from the same root as the Hebrew word tachanun. And all were written in Yiddish and in Yiddish letters. And then he mentions this book, Lev Tov and Simchas HaNefesh. This is a mistake. I should not have translated that as Simchat HaNefesh in Sfaradit. It certainly is Simchas HaNefesh. It's a Yiddish book. The book is not Meneket Rivka, it's Menekes Rivka. He says, needless to say, I never saw the book Menekes Rivka. This book, the first book written by a Jewish woman by Rivka Tiktiner. Menekes Rivka, by the way, means the nursemaid of Rivka, which even the greatest bibliographers have not seen. A defective copy of Menekes Rivka was among the charred remains of my books after the fire that fell upon my house. He says, when I was a child, I never saw this book because it was a very exceedingly rare book. No one had such a book. But at some point, he comes into possession of it. Now, he doesn't tell us when he came into possession of the book. As a child, he never saw it. By 1924, when his house burns down, he has a defective copy. By defective, he means it was missing pages. Now, he obviously was not the first owner of this book. In Beit Agnon, we have books. The oldest book that we have today is from 1534. It's a copy of Rav Yosef Albo's Sefer Ikarim. It's a very important work of medieval Jewish philosophy. So we have this book. Obviously, Agnon was not the original owner of this 1534 printing of the book, which is in remarkably good condition. But we don't know the provenance of the book. We don't know. He never recorded where or when he came into possession of a book, or where or when he bought a book. We do know that in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, in Jerusalem was one giant secondhand book market. Every other shop in Yerushalayim was secondhand books, because Jews came from Europe with their libraries in tow, and then they needed bread to eat, or they needed to marry off a daughter, and they would sell their libraries, they would sell their books in order to have money, or they would die. They would go to limkor begalach, as they say in Yiddish, right? They would shuffle off the mortal coil, and their children perhaps were less connected to the holy books of old, and they would pay the moicher svarim, the booksellers. They would pay the booksellers to come to clear out the library so that the apartment could then be turned over, right? And then the moicher svarim would double dip. They got paid to cart off the books, and then they got paid when they sold the books. Anybody who's had the unenviable task of having to clear out, maybe a parent's home when they, after 120 years, knows how, beyond the emotional discomfort of the whole thing, the logistical nightmare that's sometimes involved in that work of clearing out a home and clearing out a library. And my parents always tell me they've now downsized twice. They keep telling me they're doing me a favor. I think they're doing my sister a favor, but you understand the point. So we don't know how Agnon gets this copy of the Menekes Rivka, but it was defective. It was missing certain pages. And he says it was among the charred remains of my books after the fire that fell upon my house. And notice that word, I gave the book to my brother-in-law, Rabbi Alexander Marx Zichrono Livracha. And he gave it to the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. If the book escaped the fire in my house in 1924, only to be consumed in the fire that befell the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, I do not know. So now we need to unpack this a little bit. Alexander Marx was Agnon's brother-in-law. Agnon was married to Esther Marx. She has a brother. She has a number of siblings. She has a brother named Alexander Marx, who dies in 1953. Alexander Marx had studied in the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin. The Marxes were German Jews. Agnon was a Galicianer. He was an Austjud, and he marries this daughter of this rather well-to-do German Jewish banking family, the Marxes. Georgy Marx was the father, and Alexander Marx was a rabbi. He was ordained at the Hildesheimer. Those of you that were with us in Germany, we were there. We were at the Hildesheimer yeshiva in Berlin, and Marx studied there. And Marx he was a prized disciple and the son-in-law of Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, one of the great luminaries of the German rabbinical world. Marx played a very important role in the world of Jewish book collecting. In 1903, he accepts Solomon Schechter's invitation to move to New York to become a professor and the librarian at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, the flagship of conservative Judaism in the United States. When he gets to JTS in 1903, the library, which goes on to become one of the greatest collections of Judaica in the world, but at the time contained only 5,000 books and only three manuscripts. By the time Marx retires 50 years later, there are 165,000 books and over 9,000 manuscripts, among them some of the most important and rare manuscripts in the Jewish world, including segments of the Cairo Geniza and many other important manuscript works, which makes JTS one of the most important, perhaps the most important Jewish library outside of the state of Israel. On the morning of April 18th, 1966, this is after Marx has already died, but while Agnon is still alive, a fire breaks out in JTS. This is the New York City. There are no good pictures. It's like the difference between then and now, right? Today, it's amazing. Like we're living in crazy times, right? You turn on the news and things are happening all over Israel. Rockets are falling in Bat Yam, in Haifa, in Tel Aviv, in Ramat Gan, and where not. And we're already accustomed to the idea that in real time we're seeing footage as things are unfolding, right? And we get frustrated if you have to wait 2 minutes before the news is showing it. It wasn't always this way, right? You remember 9/11. 9/11 is something that's in all of our memories. In 9/11, it took me days. I was living here already. It took me days before I saw real footage of of what it looked like. Not still images, but moving images. But in 1966, people didn't walk around with cameras in their pockets. There aren't that many great photographs of the fire as it's burning. But here's the JTS building. It's the corner of Broadway and West 122nd Street. It's still there. It's been refurbished since the fire so many 50, well, going on nearly 60 years ago. It was a fire trap. The library was in this tower, still is in this tower. Very narrow windows, one staircase full of books, which make for great kindling. And a fire breaks out, and the whole thing goes up in flames, and many, many, many thousands of books are lost. And those that are not lost to the fire are lost to are lost to an even worse enemy of books, namely water. And 7,000 books were lost to fire, but almost as many were lost to water. And after the fire is put out, they're taking these books, some of them very, very rare books, although the rarest books were spared. Some of these rare, but they take them out into the courtyard of JTS, and they developed this method. They took paper towels. They had thousands and thousands and thousands of rolls of paper towels, and they put the paper towels in between the leaves of the books. And Jews from all over the metropolitan area, including from Yeshiva University and from some of the Haredi yeshivot in Brooklyn, come to participate in this effort to save all of these Jewish books. You understand that relationships between the conservative JTS and the Orthodox yeshivot was not always so peaceful. But et lasot lashem heferu toratecha, when the Torah is burning, they came out to rescue these books. Agnon in the late 60s, Agnon in the late 60s says, "Gee, I had a copy of the Menekes Rivka, a very, very rare book indeed." Although Agnon probably did not know exactly how rare it was, and I'm about to tell you. Agnon says, "I had this rare copy of the Menekes Rivka, this first book ever written by a Jewish woman, and it was one of the very few books that was spared in the fire in 1924, even though it was charred and burned. And I gave it to my brother-in-law, Alexander Marks, the librarian at JTS. And now the JTS library has burned down. And I wonder if it was spared the fire in Germany only to go up and smoke in New York. Question mark, end of sentence. Of course, when Agnon's writing this in the late 60s, he has no way to check, right? He can't go online. So I'm reading this one day and I say, gee, I immediately go to the catalog of the JTS Online and I discover that indeed they have a copy of the Menekes. They have a copy of the Menekes Rivka. But interestingly, it doesn't say anywhere in the catalog record that it was a gift from Agnon. Here's a copy of the Menekes Rivka that's still in the collection of the Jewish Theological Seminary. There's one extant copy of the 1609 Prague edition, and that's at the university in Germany. And there is one copy of the 1618 Krakow edition, and that's the copy that Agnon had, which made its way to JTS. There were two printings of this book, which already says a lot, that there were two editions of the book, but the book only survived in one orphan copy from each of the two printings, one from the Prague edition and one from the Krakow edition, the Krakow edition being the one that Agnon somehow came into possession of and gave to the JTS. So last year, around the time of the 100th anniversary of Agnon's house fire, I'm in New York and I go to JTS. I make an appointment with the special rare book room, and they were very friendly and very helpful. And they show me this book, but they seemed to be unaware that this book in JTS, they did not have recorded in the catalog that this was a book that came from none other than the great Nobel Prize winning Hebrew author, who was the agent for preserving the sole remaining copy of this edition of the book. And there's only one other copy that exists in the whole world. So how did this happen? The book, I'm sorry that I don't have a photograph of it from the outside. The book has obviously been rebound sometime in the last number of years, right? The cover of the book is certainly not the original cover. And presumably the cover of the book when Agnon had it was not the original cover. Book covers do not last that long. And when it was in Agnon's possession, it had probably already been rebound at least once. You know, there was this fashion in bookbinding to take basically scrap paper. The book itself is bound in these Gilio notes, these kinds of like if you look at a printed book, a hardcover book, right? So on the spine usually there's this cloth, right, in a hardcover book. So what they do is they take all of the packets, right, of the book, usually about 60 pages each, and they put them together, they stitch them together, and then in the modern world, they take this little piece of cloth and they bind it along the back with glue to hold all of the packets, the individual pamphlets, as it were, together. And then the whole thing is bound together. We use cardboard. In the medieval ages, they often used wooden boards to cover the books, but the packets of the pages have to be attached to the cover of the book somehow. So they would use basically scrap paper to be like a binding agent between the pages of the book, or the end pages, the end papers, which are often decorative, and the cover. And very often Christian printers would have loose pages of a page of the Talmud, a page of the Shulchan Aruch, all types of Jewish books, which were not precious to them. And we find in the binding, sometimes of a Christian Bible, a page of a rare printing of the Jerusalem Talmud. Right? And this way of like finding hidden things between the pages is, the stuff of which research is made. If you saw the Israeli film Footnote, Herat Shulayim, which is a kind of satire on academic politics in the Hebrew University, there's a particular scene where this happens, where a researcher is in the Vatican Library and he finds a rare manuscript of the Talmud, which had been bound inside a Christian Bible or some such. Here, what's happened inside a Yiddish book? Pum fakert, the exact opposite. What you're looking at is the outer layer of the binding paper. You see it's all charred and black. But when you turn it over, the inside, which has been removed when they rebound the book, they removed this, but they preserved it. But nobody bothered to check what this was. And it's in a clear plastic sleeve in a archive box together with the Meneket Rivka. It's a Latin text. Having studied Latin for 2 years in high school and 1 year in college, I was able to decipher this by putting it into Google Translate. It is a very long Latin poem written in the first century BCE by the Roman poet Titus Lucretius Carus, called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. On the nature of things is a very interesting work, because just like the Menekes Rivka, it too was almost lost. It too was almost lost to history. It's a very long Latin poem. It's made up of 7,400 hexameters, meaning 7,400 lines of poetry. And it's a philosophical work. Even though it's in poetry, it's a philosophical work. It was Lucretius's attempt to give a presentation of Epicurean philosophy. Among the interesting things that Epicurus taught, and which Lucretius writes about, is the idea that all, how does it go? That all uh, all things all things are made up of fire. Right? That fire in the natural elements. You remember? I mean, you must have studied this at some point. In history, the idea of the four elements and how they combine. These are ideas that come from ancient Greek science and ancient Greek philosophy. Um, uh, the idea that fire is the source of all things that are created, right? That's an idea. That's an idea that actually Lucretius presents from Heraclitus. Heraclitus is a 5th century. Lucretius is writing the 1st century BCE, and he's presenting the idea of Heraclitus, that fire is the source of all that is made. So it's interesting that this work, which kind of valorizes fire as creative source, was exactly the thing that was wrapped around the Menekes Rivka, that it itself is charred and almost burned up, this one scrap manuscript page, right? And preserves the Menekes and preserves the Menekes Rivka. But here's a really interesting thing. In his 2011 Pulitzer Prize winning study called The Swerve, there's a professor at Harvard named Stephen Greenblatt. He's most well known as a Shakespeare scholar. He wrote a very interesting book a few years ago called Will in the World, kind of about the influence, the impact, the reception history of Shakespeare in culture. But he wrote a book about this poem and about how it was almost disappeared, because in the days of manuscripts, that was the fate of the written word. Right? You could write this 7,400 line poem and it could disappear. But then this work from the 1st century BCE was rediscovered in one sole surviving manuscript. It's rediscovered in the early 15th century by a monk, named Poggio Bracciolini, who was an emissary of the Vatican, who traveled throughout Europe basically as a book collector for the Vatican Library. And he locates the lone surviving copy of De Rerum Natura in a German monastery. And thanks to his resurfacing of the work, Greenblatt says all types of very important ideas come back into fashion. And Greenblatt says those ideas were the raw material that fueled the Renaissance. Greenblatt's book about this poem, and more so its rediscovery and its re-entry to the intellectual culture in Europe, is called The Swerve. The swerve being like this idea that like history is taking one trajectory and then boom, you can take a left turn. You can take a swerve. And the subtitle of the book is How the World Became Modern. Right? And as he points to this, the discovery of this book and its ideas as a kind of greasing the wheels of the Renaissance. Right? Now, I mean, lots of things, the Renaissance doesn't happen by accident, right? But there's certain things that have to be in place in order for certain large trends to take place. So this is really fascinating. This is really fascinating because you have one book that miraculously survives antiquity in one rare copy, lies dormant for hundreds of years and unknown, and then one lone person, Poggio Bacciolari, right, finds it, reintroduces it, and it has this major impact. And this is not a manuscript. I mean, this is a manuscript page. This is not one of the original manuscript pages, you understand, right? But one of its pages of a copy that's made after its rediscovery is serving as the swaddling cloth, right? Protecting another book, this case, a Yiddish Jewish book written by a Jewish woman, right? Which completely changes the way we think about women's education and women's role and how learned women were in the early modern period, in the late Middle Ages in Prague. Right? The fact that these two things should be interconnected is just fascinating. When the fire destroys Agnon's library and almost all of the books, except for this one, Buber tells Agnon, okay, you got to get back to work. You have to go back and start rewriting this project that we've been working on together. And Agnon really was not so keen to do that. He had to focus on his own literary projects, his own novels and works of fiction. And Buber was very upset about this. And he writes a letter to the great German Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, telling him, what happened to Agnon. There was this fire. Remember, there was no Twitter, there was no WhatsApp. He had to write a letter to send the news. So he writes to Rosenzweig and he says, it's a terrible thing. And Agnon's house burns down in his library, and this project of ours is now over. So Rosenzweig writes back to Buber the following: when I received your letter and read about the misfortune that had struck Agnon, I naturally thought first that something had happened to him or to a member of his family, God forbid. So that as I read on, I felt a great sense of relief. I guess Buber buried the lead. Like, you should write the letter. Everything's okay. Agnon and his family are safe, but there was a terrible tragedy. But I guess Buber buried the lead. And as Rosenzweig is reading the letter, he has to wait till the end of the first paragraph to discover that Agnon is personally okay. So he says, I had a great sense of relief when I found out that he was alive. He says, certainly books and manuscripts are not simply material goods, but even though they are part of the body, they are still a replaceable limb. In other words, I don't know if any of you have ever suffered a flood or, God forbid, a fire. These things happen. People lose things. There was what was that big storm in New York a couple of years? Sandy. Oh, Sandy. No offense, Sandy's with us from Silver Spring, but the storm named after her. People lost everything. They lost their homes, and look at the Rahmanis. Look at these people in these homes that are being hit by these rockets. Thank God the toll to life has been what do you say? Even one is one too many. The toll to life has been miraculous. You see these buildings. You say, how does anybody walk out of there alive? But the houses are destroyed. The apartment buildings are destroyed. Right. So you hear so you think about it. Think about it. If God forbid there was a fire in your home, what would you reach for to save first? What would you take on the lifeboat if the flood waters were coming? So I don't know. You have a piece of furniture, okay? A piece of furniture, a chair, a table, right? But maybe like a photo album from the days before everything was digitized, right? And now, like everything's digitized, so you lose the photo album, you still have the photos, but it wasn't always like that. So Rosenzweig says, books, like that's the real thing. Like, what does a Jew have? A Jew has books, right? And to lose your books is a terrible thing. So he says it's not exactly like losing your life, but it's like having to amputate a limb. And then he says, Frederick the Great rewrote the history of the 7 Years' War, which his valet had used for kindling. It's a true story. Frederick the Great wrote a book, a history of the 7 Years' War from his point of view, and it got burned. Carlyle's French Revolution was also a second draft. The complete first draft was burned while in the possession of John Stuart Mill. And then he says something incredible. No, only death alone erases, not fire. What? Death alone erases, not fire. So Agnon survives. Miraculously, somehow these books survive. So it's a century and a year, 101 years since Agnon's library, since Menekes Rivka, written by Rivka Tiktiner, whose grave we would have been standing next to a week from tomorrow. We appreciate the works of these three great writers in Latin, in Yiddish, and in Hebrew. And we remember that their works have not been forgotten and not been erased and not fallen into oblivion, despite the fires and flames that somehow managed to capture them all. Now, this idea would have been central to everything we would have been talking about over the course of the week, right? How the past somehow miraculously echoes on through the present. How even ideas in the Jewish stratosphere, in the Jewish intellectual trend, which somehow go out of fashion, somehow resurface. How figures that no one had ever heard of, like Rivka Tiktiner, right, somehow comes back, and we would stand there at her grave and marvel at this remarkable life of this woman, the first Jewish woman to write a book in any language, perhaps aside from Queen Esther herself. Um, how how ideas which even disappear still have force, and how even the Jewish life which disappears. And that's the nature. I think this is, David, this is one of the things that for me is always a highlight of listening to you guiding our friends along Europe, because really we're walking through, in some ways it's remarkable to see the Jewish life. And we were going to be in places where there is Jewish life, in Prague, in Vienna, particularly in Budapest. There's really interesting things going on in Jewish life in these places, and we would have met local people, right? We have all these plans to meet people and to daven with people and to eat with people and to encounter people that are doing remarkable things for Jewish life in these, what we think of as like really, the end of the Jewish world. Um, but nevertheless, much of what we do walking around Central Europe, Eastern Europe, it's a ghost town. There's there's ghosts everywhere, right? There's the Stapelsteiner, right? These little plaques that are affixed to the sidewalks in front of buildings that say, "Here lived the family of Moshe Stein and his four children, all of whom went off to Auschwitz." And all over Europe, you have these Stapelsteiners, these little stumbling stones that are put all over to remind you of the ghosts of these places. There's a book that I read this past year that meant so much to me. Despite my own connections to literature and to Agnon, I read very, very little contemporary fiction. I wonder if many of you have read this book because it's a book that is so very much it originates in Prague, and that's Michael Chabon's The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, right? If you've read it. So first of all, those of you that are interested in the legends of the Golem should read Cavalier and Clay. But it's a very, very long, sprawling novel, and of course, much of it takes place in the United States. But Cavalier, Joe Cavalier, the one of these two cousins, who goes on to become like basically becomes the creator of Superman, right? All of those great early comic books were so Jewishly influenced. But this Cavalier, he makes some pocket money as a magician. You know, like the kind of magician that goes and plays at bar mitzvahs and those types of things. And he's the only one from his family who's gone to America before the Shoah, and he's hoping to raise money to bring over his little brother. He's worried about his parents who've been left behind. At a certain point, Hitler comes to power. Hitler invades Czechoslovakia. The letters stop coming from home, and he's unaware of what happened. And then at a certain point, he finds out the fate of his little brother, the tragic fate. We know what happened to those Jews left behind, to so many of those Jews left behind in Europe. And then the narrator says, it was at these times that he began to understand, after all those years of study and performance, of feats and wonders and surprises as a magician, the nature of magic. The magician seemed to promise that something torn to bits might be mended without a seam, that what had vanished might reappear, that a scattered handful of doves or dust might be reunited by a word, that a paper rose consumed by fire could be made to bloom from a pile of ash. But everyone knew that it was only an illusion. The true magic of this broken world lay in the ability of the things it contained to vanish, to become so thoroughly lost that they might never have existed in the first place. Right? So those are the thoughts of someone, who's done presto changeo, the rabbit disappears and can be pulled out of the hat. Right? The card you selected can be whisked out from under a sleeve. But the real magic, the evil magic of the world, is that things and people can disappear. That cultures, that books, that learning can disappear as if they never existed. And the challenge of Jewish life is to fight against that, And I think that's what we do. I think that's very much like the theme of what David and I try to convey over the course of our tours together. And I'm so sorry that we're not going to be doing this in a week from now, but hopefully soon we will all be able to do that, to Prague, Vienna, Budapest, to other locations together in good health and in times of peace. So thank you all so much. Let's all stay in touch. And we'll let you know exactly when we'll be able to get the wheels on the bus rolling again. Hopefully it'll be soon.
תודה רבה.
We can leave the microphone open if people wanted to share their thoughts about these crazy experiences that we've had.
Thank you very much.
That was a wonderful.